I want to start actually with huge thanks, both for that introduction, for this invitation to share some of this work with Mondays at Beinecke, and for hosting me today, for talking about what is a really exciting cross-library project at Yale, the Model Research Collection, which I was invited to curate for the 2022-2023 academic year. So for those of you who are in and around New Haven, I invite you to come into Bass Library and take a look at just this grouping of materials from Yale's extraordinary collections. The topic of the collection, which I'm going to talk about today, is Lyric Thinking, Poetry in the World. And it's a collection of 1,000 books, along with a growing online exhibit that expands its focus into Yale's special collections. But before I jump in, I'd like to give a shout out to all the library folks who've made this incredible undertaking possible. Thanks to Katie Webb and Jay Rossman, who initially invited me to curate this collection, and especially to Katie, Monica Reed, and Carla Barish, who have worked tirelessly to bring it all together. And thanks, no least, to the wonderful library staff working with Chris Kilheffer, who pulled the 1,000 books that comprise the core of this model research collection. So let me see if I can get this going. Here we go. So in spring 2022, when I was asked to imagine the task of choosing 1,000 books on a research topic, my first thought was, of course, lyric poetry. Not only did I happen to be working on a book project on lyric poems from across the world, I have long been fascinated by the various ways in which poetry appears in our lives. It can mark special events and anniversaries. It offers consolation or celebration. It's decorative, memorable, snarky, witty, and sometimes just cheesily bad. It also takes many different forms across various languages and cultures. For instance, we might ask, what connects these poems here from Iran with these other poems, a manuscript of Langston Hughes's old Uzbek poem? Or this, the opening poem of Petrarch's Rerum Vulgarium Fragmenta, written in the 14th century, with this Shiviti emblem of a psalm that is used in religious worship. These images, I would kind of quickly add, form a suite of postcards that Monica Reed designed for the Model Research Collection. And if you are on campus, please come on in and take a few, because they are in fact beautiful and celebrate objects in Yale's collections that I'll talk a little bit about today. The range of these images, from medieval Persian and Italian to contemporary English, to devotional practice, emblematic and visual, as well as devotional in its use. All of these images have something in common. And we might ask, what is lyric? All cultures we know have shortish, first-person poems that reflect an experience of the world. In the West, we have come to call this lyric, a term that goes back at least to Horace, but is certainly centered on Petrarch. Is this a term that can be used to describe poems in non-Western languages? In traditions that do not have a name for lyric, can we, for instance, think of psalms and devotional hymns as being lyric in their core? Can poems speak to each other and to readers across linguistic divides? How do we come, for instance, to feel moved by a poem that comes out of a completely different cultural matrix or language or idiom? Do poems matter in the real world, in the roughness of political struggle and the poignancy of our social belonging? These are some of the questions that I set out to think about and that this model research collection seeks to foreground. Many of us are familiar with famous English poems, poems we know to be canonical, like Shakespeare's sonnets, here taken from the Yale collection, or politically and nationally crucial, like Langston Hughes's famous Let America Be America Again. There are poems we turn to for emotional comfort or pleasure, and I note here a poem written by a refugee child. Some of us write poems we call lyric and wonder if they are any good. Many of us enjoy poems performed, whether that takes the form of a pop ballad or the slam poetry competition. And here I've also given you an image of the futurist poetry, which celebrates sound materially on the page. But too often in academic settings, lyric poetry is the province of high aesthetic analysis, while popular songs belong to cultural studies or history. Lyric thinking as a model research collection, a collection of different kinds of materials from the libraries, tries to get away from these old divisions between aesthetics and politics, between a kind of formal scholarly consideration of poetic devices and figures and national literary traditions, to ask, what is it like to experience a poem? What happens when we give ourselves over to the distinctive first-person view of lyric and ask, what kind of thinking is made possible through this poem? What kinds of connections or experience of the world does the poem open up that I had not seen, felt, or thought before? And how can we capture the various ways in which poetry exists in the world through all of the different books, recordings, images, and objects that we have in Yale's collections? So when I was asked to curate a model research collection, my first question was, what is a model research collection and how do we in fact model research? I had to reflect on my own research process, which I will confess is chaotic, expansive, filled with multiple sources and notes in different languages, through different media, often in different disciplines. So as I was thinking about this, I came up with a set of reflections for myself. That a model research collection is a gathering together of knowledge on a topic. It needs to be capacious and wide-ranging. It's a constellation of ideas that in some ways are distinctive to the person who's thinking through this topic. It's a set of intellectual tentacles that reach out and connect in different ways. But also, there are certain constraints to Yale's notion of the model research collection. There can only be books and no ebooks. There can be no journal articles, no special collections, but we did sneak in some DVDs and recordings. And the online exhibition of this, which I think Mike has put in the chat, begins to connect this out to materials in the special collections that we couldn't actually physically have in the BAS space. So why might we make a model research collection? To simply model how we think about research, the ways in which research is complex, dynamic, reaches in different ways, and in some ways is messy and requires putting together a mind map, which is in fact what I did. The process of just mapping out the ways in which I thought about lyric poetry in my own work, in my teaching, in my reading interests as a non-scholar, but also in the ways in which I think collections organize the places in which poetry lives, whether it's in special collections, in libraries, or in galleries, is something of the picture I tried to make in setting out this mind map. And this is a mind map that you can look at more online. It's also physically in BAS. And it's an effort to kind of break down the ways in which we might think about poetry and how it exists in the world. To the right of your screen, in what are the kind of blue-green colors, I try to think about social places of poetry in the world. So the ways in which poetry tells us something about our relationship to the environment, to technology, to nature, to animals, the materiality of poetry itself. What is it written on? With what is it written? What are the places in which it's found? The spaces and places in which poetry exists. And this can be, as inscriptions on stone monuments. It can also be as fragments of poems on mugs that we drink coffee out of in the morning, right? Quite apart from the more traditional places we think of poetry existing in books, in manuscripts, in letters. We can think about poetry's relationship to what we might call anthropology, to ritual, to religion, to philosophy, to devotion, to liturgy. We can think about poetry's relationship to performance, to the drama, to theater, to film, to song. And then on the left-hand side of this mind map, I tried to map out the more traditional literary ways in which poetry is studied. Poetry has its own histories and different language traditions, right? And those languages are multiple and many. Sometimes they coalesce, sometimes they're distinctive. Central to that, of course, is the act of translation, which allows us to experience poems in languages and cultures we may not otherwise be able to engage with. Poetry has, since its inception, possibly had a political and social function, a function in propaganda, in revolution, in protest, in courting and court poetry. We might think about poetry's relationship to identity, to the body, to the ways in which it touches on who we are and how we construct ourselves in different parts of our lives in the world. So this mind map became a kind of template for me to begin to pull together this collection of 1,000 books that produce the model research collection. What I'd like to do for the remaining of my time before we open up for questions at this point is just to offer you some examples of the ways in which poetry lives and exists in the collections, and to give you really three sets of examples here. The first set of examples I want to talk about, and before I go there, here is the link again to the online exhibit, which we're still building. And you can see here in the online exhibit that we've tried to break down, based on the mind map that I just shared, different ways into thinking about the place of poetry in the world, thinking about histories and language traditions, politics and society, identity, performance and materiality, religion and philosophy, the environment, the body. And of course, there are many, many more ways in which we could consolidate or break down the ways in which poetry moves through the world. So what I want to do now is to move through a set of examples just to highlight different ways in which poems live across time and in collections. The first set of examples I want to share has to do with the 14th century Italian poet Petrarch and the many afterlives of Petrarchan poetry. Many of you might know that Petrarch began a vogue for sonnets and love poetry that extended for almost 300 years across Europe and in the New World. This is the manuscript, a kind of a late 15th century manuscript made in Florence in the Beinecke's collections of the Rerum Vulgarium Fragmenta, this collection of 366 poems, one for each day of the year, in Italian, that found imitators in every single European languages in the subsequent centuries. We have here an example of women writers in the 16th century. This is a volume printed in Venice in 1553 with a collection of poems by many famous contemporary writers, including women. Here we have, the page is open to a minor Italian woman writer, Ippolita Mirtilla, writing in the Petrarchan idiom of the sonnet. Here is a 19th century diary of an English traveler to Italy visiting the so-called tomb of Petrarch and drawing an image of it, and then drawing an image of what appears to be the view from Petrarch's house. So you can see here the continuing fascination of poems and poetry and poets across time, right? The kind of continued interest of Petrarch in this kind of early 19th century kind of romantic moment still. Here we have a kind of a wonderful item in the Beinecke's collections. It is a collection of poems by the French Renaissance writer Pierre de Ronsard, another imitator of Petrarch, with illustrations by Henri Matisse. This is one of a bespoke edition of 320 copies, and even more special, it's one of 20 copies that has an extra set of lithographs by Matisse. And these reprint these French Renaissance poems with Matisse's drawings in the kind of like mid-20th century Paris. And finally, in keeping with the long afterlife of Petrarchan poetry, here is a translation by Ezra Pound of a 16th century French poem by Joachim du Bellay, also based on Petrarchan sonnets. And here is Pound's translation into English of this French poem that in turn thinks back to this kind of Italian classical original that Petrarch kind of invents or brings into being. So we see here over 400 or 500 years, the ways in which a set of poems has all sorts of different afterlives in all sorts of different languages, media, and engagements, right? I mean, thinking about not just the poem itself, but the way in which the memory of the poem affects a tourist in the 19th century who might make drawings in his diary, thinking of poems that he may have read, and perhaps experienced not even in Italian, but in English translation. Another set of poems that I want to talk briefly about have to do with thinking here about the ways in which the same set of poems in a poetic collection are reproduced over hundreds of years in different formats in different places. So here we have a 15th century manuscript of the collected poems of the Persian poet Hafez. This is his divan, and we believe this is a version from 1497 or 1498, a manuscript copy, and with illustrations, as you can see over here, and you can see the way in which poetic volumes here in Persian often incorporate sort of special forms of calligraphy, design elements, illuminations and miniatures, as you can see over here. The same collection of Hafez's Divan here in a late 17th century edition. You can see the way in which the calligraphy itself helps us think differently about what the poem is doing on the page. Here we have a 19th century manuscript of Hafez's Divan with rich illumination, possibly made again in Iran, but this could be actually from South Asia as well. And finally, a lithograph from the late 19th century from Lucknow in India of Hafez's Divan. And you can see here how the printed lithograph imitates the form of the manuscript and the long tradition of the making of this kind of manuscript with its illumination that goes all the way back to the 15th century, the late 15th century. So modern technologies that reproduce older ways of experiencing with the poem on the page. Want to look briefly here at poets' archives. The Beinecke is especially rich in the archives of American poets of the 20th and 21st centuries. Just giving you brief examples of the correspondence between Gwendolyn Brooks and Langston Hughes from the Langston Hughes papers. Of course, Brooks's typescripts exist within the Hughes papers as part of the Hughes archive. And many major American poets have their archives here at the Beinecke, which produces another way to think about how poetry is produced through sets of social relations, through the back and forth between poets. And we can capture that by looking at their persistence in the archives. I want to end with an example, kind of an unusual example of what might be considered both an artist's book and a contemporary political use of poetry in the world. And this is Philip Metris's Abu Ghraib Arias, later published as the volume Sand Opera. And this, we have one of a small set of editions that were produced in 2011 with the paper made through the Combat Paper Project, which is wrappers made from veterans' uniforms. Abu Ghraib Arias was made in protest of the torture of prisoners at Abu Ghraib. You can see here that it's partly a set of poems made through erasure, partly found poems based on documents of transcripts from associated with that particular political episode. The poems themselves are an act of protest, and the making of the poems, you can see here in their wrappers and their printing and the way in which they talk about erasure and visibility, are very much engaged not just in aesthetic practice, but in making an important kind of political statement about our own contemporary world. I'd like to end my presentation and hold time for questions by pointing to this inset from the poet, writer, educator June Jordan that exists on the wrapper of every single book in the model research collection. And we made the decision to put these little inserts into the books, which we hope that people will check out and that they will take out this insert and take it away with them. And I'm just going to read this quotation that I think is a particularly kind of powerful way of thinking about what poetry is. We often think of poetry as something that is difficult and hard and that no one reads it anymore and we don't care about poems anymore. And I think that this could not be further from the truth. If we just take a moment to think about the various ways in which poetry in an ample way exists in our everyday lives, I think we might surprise ourselves at its persistence in our world. So I'll end with this quotation from June Jordan. And so poetry is not a shopping list, a casual disquisition on the colors of the sky, a soporific daydream, or bumper sticker sloganeering. Poetry is a political action undertaken for the sake of information, the faith, the exorcism, and the lyrical invention that telling the truth makes possible. Poetry means taking control of the language of your life. Good poems can interdict a suicide, rescue a love affair, and build a revolution in which speaking and listening to somebody becomes the first and last purpose to every social encounter. So I'm going to stop there and open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Ayesha, and what a brilliant and fantastic gift your social encounter with us is this afternoon. The first question I want to ask and invite everyone to consider posting questions using the Q&A function is a little bit about your origin story to scholarship, sort of what set you on the path to become a professor of comparative literature, to consider comparative literature as a field, and what some of the influences that brought you to where you are now?
That's such a great question. And, I have a funny origin story because I never thought I would end up as a professor of comparative literature. I was an undergraduate double major in English and political science, and I thought I was going to change the world and do international law. And in fact, as an undergraduate, had the extraordinary opportunity to study in Geneva and be an intern, like the millions of interns in that city, at the International Labour Office and at the UN kind of High Commissioner for Human Rights. And ironically, one of the things I learned as a kind of undergraduate sort of doing odd jobs was how much the desire to change the world is often dreams of big change when the change that matters is really small change. And so I found myself somewhat disappointed with the work I was doing that seemed to go nowhere on kind of torture laws, which we all know are not actually going to change the world tomorrow morning. And instead found myself captivated by a small project I was part of on thinking about educational reform, actually, that the World Bank at that time in the late 90s was sponsoring in Afghanistan. And I found myself when I came back and was thinking about, am I going to law school or graduate school, thinking I really care about the way in which reading and learning and access to education transforms people's lives. And like, maybe that's actually the place where I'm going to change the world, and not being a lawyer somewhere, in a fancy office in a distant city. And so, much to my parents' dismay, I decided to do a PhD in literature, and found myself fascinated at the ways in which literature is so powerfully linked into political and social realities for people in all times and places. So I found myself working, and primarily an early modernist. I work mostly in the literature and culture of the 16th and 17th century. But I'm fascinated by the ways in which what we understand to be literary culture can be capacious and groundbreaking. I write about the humanists. I write about early forms of empire, about the ways in which people have turned to forms of thinking, writing, and expression to reshape the worlds around them, to protest, to revolt, to remake possibilities for themselves, for social mobility. And so I found that in my own scholarship, I study the sorts of things that I really think happen to our students in our own world. So it's an odd origin story. I do love poetry, I do love literature, but I also care deeply about what they can make possible for the kinds of ways we can imagine our own place in the world.
No, thank you for that. And I think you've done such a magnificent job, and the June Jordan quote really centers this about how poetry is everywhere. We're in a season right now of some of the great celebrations of many of the world's leading religions, and poetry is at the center of all of those celebrations. As you point out, it's the anniversary of the Good Friday Accords in Ireland, and Seamus Heaney is everywhere in every story, and the image on the New York Times opinion page yesterday. And of course, in America, I hadn't thought about this when we scheduled this. It is National Poetry Month.
Yes, absolutely.
Which happens to be at Beinecke and Yale all 12 months, but this is the one that has the capital N. So it really is great to have all of these things centered. We've got a number of questions, and I'll have a few more of my own. But the first question asks you to be a bit of a prognosticator about poetry. So big question, what are the future trends in lyric poetry?
It's a great question. And I would say, in what language and in what media? I think one of the things that is fascinating to me as both a scholar and a consumer of lyric poetry is the explosion of poetry on the internet. Many of us as scholars tend to sort of say, oh, well, that's not really what we study because it's not good. But I actually think the index of how much the world of poetry is thriving has to do with the ways in which people share their own poems, share poems they love with each other, with their loved ones, online and on social media. So I think what's fascinating about one of the trends, so to speak, in lyric poetry is a kind of internationalization of poetry, which is to say people are reading, translating, and sharing poems across languages and cultures at a rate that I think is pretty unprecedented. I think people have always read poems across different cultural forms, but I think we have the means to do it now that we didn't before. So you can YouTube, performances of poems by Faiz, for instance, the great Pakistani Indian poet, Urdu poet, that are performed by all sorts of people across different parts of the world, right? And we can read his poems, we can see them in translation across multiple languages, and we can see him as part of a kind of larger global culture of poetry, right? So people are writing with all sorts of different influences that they can access because of the ways and the speed at which they're being shared. So if I had to make a prediction, what fascinates me is the way in which poetry is growing out of a kind of melding together of lots of different literary traditions in a way that they have often been kept apart in the past. So as somebody who's a scholar of comparative literature, I'm interested in how people read not just within a linguistic or literary or national tradition, but across those traditions. And I think in the future, we're going to see more and more of that as people are able to access poems from different parts of the world.
Thank you so much for that. We were talking a little bit before we began about biblical poetry, and I think some about, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh. Mm-hmm. And I raised that in the sort of sense of embodied word that's very much in what you're talking about. And you are somebody who is very much a user, a sharer, a scholar of the tangible, of physical materials, of the physical archive here at Beinecke and elsewhere. And you could teach and do teach poetry in a classroom where it is just the words, as it were, but you also are very active in using the tangible materials. And I wonder if you could just sort of reflect for our audience on what that brings to your scholarship, what that brings to teaching, to have the physical materials of the archive as part of your scholarly practice and part of your teaching practice.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful question. And it's a question that I think that also touches on the ways in which poetry is a material object and in ways that we don't always reflect on. And what I mean by that is many of us can remember, a treasured poem or a line of poetry that someone may have written to us, or a book that somebody gave us that was meaningful, or the printing of a hymn at someone's funeral that we kind of hold on to because it's our token to something else, or the favorite recording in the old days when we had CDs, right? I mean, like we held on to CDs or cassette tapes that were like these meaningful things that were not just about the thing we heard that was intangible, or the words, or the music, but something about the token that we can hold on to that suggests the distinctive ways in which we consumed or shared or distributed these poems. So when I teach poetry, I do two things. I make my students memorize poems because I think there's a long and important history of memorizing and reciting poems where they literally become part of your body as your voice and your mind holds them and imprints them in a certain way. And I make them think about the physical traces of the poem, whether it's in manuscript, whether it's in printing, whether it's in their own keeping of commonplace books, whether it's in, as I like to say, I mean, we underestimate the way in which poems exist in ceramic forms or on t-shirts, right? And I think that thinking about these two things, the materiality of holding on to something in your mind by memory and holding on to it in the materiality of the archive, are things that go together, but also the things that change over time, right? The ways in which scribes are writing and producing beautiful manuscripts for luxury consumption in the pre-modern world, the ways in which people commonplace, because they didn't have access to easily bought cheap printed books, but they wanted to make their own books in which they wrote down their favorite poems, show us a long history of the ways in which people have engaged with poetry, which was pre-digital, right? Today, many of us have digital scrapbooks where we like stick in things, which are actually just a somewhat different version of the early modern commonplace book, just on our computers. So I like to think about the long entwined histories of poetry and media, of poems and as objects and not just as words that we might think about that can be easily moved from one format to the next, and the ways in which the kind of somatic nature of the body, which poems would define and work through when we read them, are connected in close ways to the archive that records traces of that body, right? So I think thinking about poetry in this very materialized way, I think helps students understand how complicatedly entwined poems are with the social world, right? They're not just something that we can remove from the ways in which they are produced, consumed, and move through our cultures.
Thank you so much for that. A number of questions from the audience. So somebody asks, it says, I love Phil Metris's work. Can you talk about the challenges and opportunities in representing the material dimensions of text like Metris's collection?
Yeah, that is such a great question. And that's one of the places where, you know, having access to the resources of something like the Beinecke is pretty extraordinary, because of course the printed version of Sand Opera could not do what the kind of initial printing of Abu Ghraib arias does in its kind of literal material form with its sort of casing. And I think I can go back to that here. And you can see here too, speaking of materiality, just the actual printing of this with the erasures, the kind of both the erasures that are the poet's removal of certain words, but also the censoring, the marking off in black, the shadings of the printing itself and the difficulty of representing that on the page. And then looking here just at the wrapper, right? And thinking about the ways in which the gray and the black of the printing here shift how we understand what the words themselves are doing. So reproducing this is actually really difficult. If you think about just like copying it out or putting it, you know, in a Word document, like you simply cannot reproduce the effect of what this work is trying to do. And yet at the same time, Sand Opera is published. You can buy it on Amazon, and it attempts to reproduce in its typography some of the effects of these kinds of original printings. So this is one of those instances in which the poem is inseparable from its materiality, and they work hand in hand. I'm fascinated actually by artists' books, of which there are many in the Book Arts collection here at Yale, where you cannot separate out the poem from the way in which it's printed, because so much of its message is in fact in its medium, right? To misquote Marshall McLuhan. So I think that the more we can think about these poems as objects themselves, as words that need to find material form, but also vocal form, and that we're thinking about orality and vision, right, together becomes really important, is the sort of thing we need to do to be able to read poems like this.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for that response. And also is evoking the great show that was here that Kevin Repp curated, Beyond Words, on experimental poetry and the avant-garde and the materiality of poetry. And this is a great center for that, collections and studies. And again, it's so great that you are a leader in activating the collections and sharing them both with scholarly audiences as well as with public audiences through programs like this one. I wanted to ask a little bit about sort of where comparative literature is now. Talk about, you know, what you sort of see and hear from students and their interests, and some, again, to prognosticate a little bit where you see the field of comparative literature going on this campus and in others.
This is such a hard question because, you know, we always joke that comparative literature does not really know what it is, that it's a discipline that is both everywhere and nowhere. And one of the things worth saying is historically comparative literature emerged with a desire to sort of see if there was some kind of universal humanity we could extract by reading literature across different languages. Today, we're sort of suspicious of universalizing in these ways, or saying that there's some kind of like central human essence that literature can like show us. But still, I think that we share some kind of desire to connect through language and through literature. So I think comparative literature today really grapples with what it means to be studying, reading, and thinking across languages. What that term comparative is a complicated word, because what exactly are we comparing is something that we always struggle with. So here at Yale, I think in the field at large, one of the crucial things that comparative literature is committed to doing is thinking about language and literatures in multiple languages as capaciously as possible. It used to be that comparative literature was primarily the province of Western European languages. So French and German, everybody had to have French and German, probably Latin, and then you could study anything else from there, but your scope was often pretty narrow. Today, comparative literature is a vast and growing field in which people work in languages from every single part of the world, the connections to linguistics, for instance, to histories of language, to materiality, to media, to film, to all kinds of literary production of various kinds in different sites, is really exciting and dynamic. In my own work, I'll say, really excited about the relationship between literature and anthropology, thinking about the ways in which literature, particularly poetry in my case, exists in kind of a phenomenological way in the world, and how can we think about the effects it has on cultures, communities, and people. Literature and translation is a huge part of comparative literature. Those of us who work in multiple languages know that we are translating in our heads, in our scholarship, to our students all the time, and translation takes all sorts of different forms. It's not simply about transferring words from one language to another. It's thinking about how can we communicate entire idioms and traditions in that single act of moving between languages. And I think in our current contemporary world, and the difficult times that we're in, comparative literature is grappling with its own political mission to be inclusive at the level of literary and cultural studies. And I think that that's probably the most exciting aspect of the field.
Thank you for that. Two questions to close us out before I do. Just a program note. Next Mondays at Beinecke will feature Constance Kunst, who's one of the curators, the librarian for Judaic Studies, one of the
She's
curators.
amazing.
Okay. In our current building-wide show. And actually, she is amazing. And the objects that she's going to share about are ones that bring together lots of different languages. So it'll be a continuation of the comparative literature. So next Monday, and the information's in the chat. A reminder that these talks are archived on YouTube, so you'll be able to see a recording of this one in a week or so and share it with others. And again, encourage everybody to take Ayesha's invitation to stop by Bass Library if you're on campus around New Haven, both to see the model research collection as well as for the postcards, as you mentioned. So penultimate question, it's an open-ended one. So whatever you want to think, what are some of the materials that you would have wished to include but fell beyond the scope of the model research collection in terms of format?
What a great question. I have to say I sneaked in recordings only because they didn't notice that they were cataloged in Bass Library, which was pretty amazing because I was told that I could not include music. So I would have loved to include materials from the music library and from the film library, which I couldn't, because I think thinking about music and poetry, or the way in which poetry and offers a kind of aesthetic for the way in which film develops its own kind of language, was something that I was interested in thinking about. I was also interested in thinking about poetry as it exists in the medical historical library. One of the things that we don't talk about or think about a lot is the relationship between poetry and therapy, in which there is a huge scholarship actually in the medical literature and the social sciences. We recently invited the poet A.E. Stallings to come to Yale just a couple of weeks ago, and she was talking about her work teaching poetry workshops to refugees in Athens who come from the Middle East and cross the Mediterranean, and how powerful this act of writing in a range of different languages with the help of translators actually is. So I would have really liked to have delved more into that and to kind of bring in materials really from what are often considered outside the humanities to think about the way in which poetry can be so utterly transformative in people's lives. And that's something that, at some point, perhaps I'll revisit.
I think we can be excited that lyric thinking is coming for all your departments, people across campus. They may not know it, but lyric poetry is part of what they do and can help excavate what they do and how they do it.
You know, what's funny, Mike, is that when I talk about this project to people, everyone has a favorite poem or memory that they want to share. And it doesn't matter what field they're in or what culture they're from. Maybe it's that they are, reading the same poem to their child in like a sort of picture book. Maybe it's that they remember a lullaby that was sung to them. Maybe there's a particularly important kind of liturgical thing that they care about. But everyone has it. And, when you ask, it bubbles up in unexpected ways. And so I would just invite our listeners to kind of think about what that thing is for them, because it is right there and probably pretty close to the surface.
Breaking news, you heard it here and the map showed it. Lyric poetry is at the center of everything.
Absolutely.
Now we understand the world. I want to close with a line from June Jordan and just use that as a prompt for you to take wherever you want to go, sort of in the center of that marvelous quote that you shared. And it is this: poetry means taking control of the language of your life. And as you think about your life and poetry and taking control of its language, I just wonder if you might use that as a prompt for any closing thoughts by way of benediction for all of us today.
Benediction. You know, I think I came to this project as a scholar in part because I kept asking myself, people love poems. As scholars and teachers, why don't we have a good language for talking about what it is that we love about poems, right? It's not just poetic figures and rhetoric and form and all of the things that we teach our students and talk about, but it's something about the experience of selfhood, of finding an articulation for who we think we are or how we feel or how we think about our place in the world that poetic language distinctively makes possible. So that particular phrase makes me think about how the precision of language, of poetic language, it's sort of its sounds, its images, the way it asks us to think and articulate where we are in a particular moment in time, in our own body, in our own selves, in our distinctive subjectivities. That for me is what I look for in my teaching and my research around why poetry matters.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today. We've had a great crowd, and I think we can all agree that Ayesha Ramachandran is a professor and a poet, and we are fortunate to have been able to share her lyric thinking this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us, and Ayesha, most particularly, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Mike. This was so fun. Thank you.